Assalamu alaikum dear students, and welcome to Dr. Roomi's lectures. We are studying the nervous system physiology, and in our very first lecture on introduction to nervous system physiology, we have studied how nervous system is compared to endocrine system and what are the various types of neuronal cells, the afferent neurons, interneurons, and efferent neurons, their structure, their function, and their location. We have also studied the organization of nervous system, which is organized into peripheral and central nervous system and their divisions. Now in today's session, we will study that our nervous system is very similar to computer in its function. Just like in computer, there are three important parts. One is the input circuits, like keyboard and mouse. They are very similar to the sensory tracts of our body, which take signal from the sensory receptors and give that information to the central nervous system. Then in our computer, we have central processing unit. This central processing unit is very similar to our higher brain centers, like our cerebral cortex, which stores information and also processes information to generate an appropriate response. So CPU is similar to our higher brain centers like cerebral cortex. And in computer we also have output circuits. The output of computer is like the screen of our computer, and also like printers, which give a response to our input. So whenever we want to print something, we give a command to our computer, so that signal given to the computer using our mouse and keyboard is just like the sensory signal going to our nervous system. And CPU, which collects that sensory information, perceives it, processes it, and on the basis of past memory, then generates an appropriate response. So CPU is very similar to our brain. And then output circuits, they are like the screen of a computer. So just like when you're searching Google, so that gives you a response on the screen. And also when you click the button print, it gives you print on a paper. So this is just like output. And output circuits of a computer, they are like the motor division of our nervous system. They are like the motor tracts of our nervous system. Let's have an overview. What are the major parts of our central nervous system? As you know that central nervous system, it contains two main parts. One is the brain and the other one is spinal cord. Brain, it has got three parts: the forebrain, then is our midbrain, and then is our hindbrain. Forebrain is made by structures like our cerebral hemispheres and some other parts. Those other parts, they are our thalamus, hypothalamus, and the other deeper nuclei like basal ganglia, hippocampus, and amygdala. So they are all collectively called as forebrain. Another term used for forebrain is prosencephalon. Prosencephalon. And this prosencephalon, it can be further divided into two. One is diencephalon, and the other one is telencephalon. The term diencephalon means this is in between the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. And diencephalon, it is made of two structures. One is the thalamus here. So this part of our brain is thalamus. This is thalamus. And the other one is hypothalamus. Thalamus and hypothalamus, they are separated by a sulcus which is called as hypothalamic sulcus. So these two parts, which you are able to see on the medial surface of the brain. You see here, this is the mid sagittal section of the brain, and you are able to see the medial surface of the brain. Thalamus and hypothalamus, they are called as diencephalon, and everything else in our forebrain is called as telencephalon, which means telencephalon, it comprises of the cerebral cortex, the white matter in our cerebral hemispheres, basal ganglia, and the amygdala, hippocampus. So all those things collectively they are called as telencephalon. The other term for the midbrain, here this is midbrain. So we can say that here this is midbrain. And the other term which is used to describe midbrain is mesencephalon. And hindbrain is a collective term for three parts: pons, medulla, and cerebellum. So here this is pons, this is medulla oblongata, medulla, and here this is cerebellum. So these three structures, pons, medulla, and cerebellum, they are collectively called as hindbrain. And the other term used to describe hindbrain is rhombencephalon. So we are having an overview of the central nervous system. As I said, central nervous system is made by brain and spinal cord. The brain, it is divided into three parts: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Forebrain is also called as prosencephalon, and it is further divided into diencephalon and telencephalon. Diencephalon is made by thalamus and hypothalamus, and telencephalon is all the other forebrain other than diencephalon, which means telencephalon comprises of cerebral cortex, the white matter of the cerebral hemispheres, the basal ganglia, amygdala, and hippocampal formation. And midbrain, which is present in between the forebrain and hindbrain, this is a small structure also called as mesencephalon. And hindbrain, also called as rhombencephalon, it is made by three structures: pons, medulla, and cerebellum. Please keep in mind that these three structures, the midbrain, pons, and medulla, these three collectively are also called as brain stem. So now keep in mind that midbrain, pons, and medulla, they're also called as brainstem. They're just like a stem on which our brain is resting. So they're also part of our brain. So just to give you an overview of the functions of the central nervous system, first let's begin with the functions of spinal cord. Spinal cord is located most caudally. Caudally means towards the tail, downward, and the extension of spinal cord is from the base of our skull till the first lumbar vertebra. And spinal cord, it contains 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So it means from both sides the nerves arise, and these pairs, so spinal cord is segmented, and there is one pair of spinal nerve which arises from each segment, and total are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Each nerve is a mixed nerve, which means it contains a sensory component as well as motor component. So if you talk about the functions of spinal cord, these functions can be studied even if when we cut the spinal cord from the brain, then some of the activities can be performed by our spinal cord. Like, it is helpful for a person to support his body on the ground against gravity. This is important for walking movements. Spinal cord is also important for controlling the reflexes of our gastrointestinal tract and for urinary excretion. And spinal cord is also important to control the functions of blood vessels. So it means there are some reflexes which are controlled even at the level of spinal cord. No doubt the higher centers, they do affect those reflexes, but spinal cord also has got some uh, integration for some of the reflexes which I have mentioned. Then some of the activities in our nervous system, they are coordinated at the subcortical level or the lower brain level. And those subcortical levels, they are the brainstem, medulla, pons, midbrain, our cerebellum, the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the basal ganglia, and our limbic system. So all these structures collectively, they are called as subcortical level. It works subconsciously. It's not under our, we are not aware of the functions which are being performed by these subcortical levels, and it controls the functions like controlling our balance, posture, equilibrium, and also to control the movements of our eyes. Wherever our head is moving, eyes are also following it. And it also controls our blood pressure, controls our respiratory movements, cough, sneeze. So this kind of activities, they are controlled at our subcortical levels. And the third level is the cortical level, or the higher brain level. So that cortical level is the level of our cerebral cortex. As you know, that cerebral cortex is a big storehouse of memory. And this cerebral cortex, this is responsible to perceive the sensory information, to store the important data, and comparing the incoming information with the past memory, this generates appropriate motor responses. And the actions which are very precise, like typing using a keyboard, it's a very precise action. This kind of activities, they are performed by the cerebral cortex. So it means our cerebral cortex, along with the subcortical levels, is responsible for making very precise movements. And also our sensations, which are very precisely located, they are perceived in our higher brain level, or the cortical level. So just to summarize, there are three important levels at which the functions are performed by our nervous system: the spinal level, as I have mentioned, the walking movements, and the defecation reflex, the urinary micturition reflex, they are coordinated here at the level of spinal cord. And then we have subcortical level, or we can also call it subconscious level. So all the structures which are present in between the spinal cord and the cerebral cortex, they are collectively called as subcortical level. And here important functions like blood pressure regulation, respiration regulation, they are controlled. And then we have the most developed level, also called as the cortical level, or the higher brain level. Here, the cortical level is responsible for those activities which are very precise. It uses its past memory and processes the new information and controls very precise movements. Like when we are typing, our movements are very precise. So these kind of movements, they are controlled by the cerebral cortex, definitely along with the other subcortical areas. So if you talk about the important features and functions of all these parts of the central nervous system, spinal cord, as I mentioned, is an important structure which contains the ascending and descending tracts. The ascending tracts, because they're taking information from down upwards, they're also called as sensory tracts. And the descending tracts, they're also called as motor tracts. They are bringing information from the higher centers towards the muscles. So what is the difference between a nerve and a tract? A nerve is outside of the central nervous system, and the nerve fibers, they are myelinated by Schwann cells, and a tract is present within the central nervous system, like dorsal column tract and spinothalamic tract. And these tracts, they are myelinated by another type of glial cell, which is called as oligodendrocyte. As I have mentioned, spinal cord is important to coordinate some reflexes like defecation reflex, urination reflex. It is also important for walking movements and to control your posture against gravity. And spinal cord also controls the function of your blood vessels. What about medulla oblongata? The medulla oblongata is is an important structure which controls some important life support functions. Like this is important to regulate your blood pressure, respiratory movements. So it contains some centers for the regulation of blood pressure, respiratory movements, and also centers for cough, sneeze, and vomiting. They're also present in our medulla. What do you mean by a center? Center is a group of cell bodies which are present within the central nervous system. So any group of cell bodies which is present within central nervous system, that's called as a center or nucleus. Um, so there are various centers or nuclei which are present in the medulla, and that they regulate blood pressure, respiration, cough, sneeze, and vomiting. Pons. Pons, along with the medulla, is also important for regulation of respiration. Pons is also important to control your posture. Yes, along with the spinal cord and medulla and cerebellum. Pons is also important to uh, make a connection between our cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. So it means signals which are coming from the cerebral cortex, those signals, when they come to the pons, these signals can be given to the cerebellum. So pons is an important structure which connect our cerebral cortex signals to the cerebellum. What about midbrain? Midbrain, it contains some nuclei which are relay centers for the auditory system and the visual system. So it means the nerve fibers in the pathways of visual system and auditory system, they have some nuclei here where synapses are made. And the midbrain is also important to control our eye movements. If you talk about thalamus, thalamus is the most important relay station in our brain, and it has got nuclei on which the synapses or relays are made. So sensory information which is going from down upwards, that's relayed here in the thalamus. So almost all the sensory information except some olfactory sensation, some, it means some olfactory sensation also passes through thalamus, but a little bit olfactory sensation does not pass through thalamus. So almost all the sensory information is relayed through thalamus to the higher centers of our brain, and similarly the motor signals which are coming from the higher centers, they also pass through thalamus downwards. So thalamus is a very important relay station. If you talk about hypothalamus, hypothalamus is important to control the functions of body like water balance, food intake, our temperature regulation. Hypothalamus is also a very important uh, structure which regulates your endocrine functions, because hypothalamus, it has connections with our pituitary gland. Hypothalamus is connected with our pituitary by two ways. With the anterior pituitary, hypothalamus is connected through a vascular function, through a portal function. It picks releasing hormones and release inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus, and those hormones, they travel along blood vessels to the anterior pituitary, and then the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary is either increased or decreased. Our posterior pituitary is connected with hypothalamus directly, and the cell bodies of some neurons which are present in the hypothalamus, they release their hormones like ADH and oxytocin directly into the posterior pituitary gland. So it means pituitary is very closely related with the hypothalamus. So posterior pituitary is attached with the hypothalamus through the neuronal connection, and the anterior pituitary is attached with the hypothalamus through the vascular portal connection. What about um, the cerebral hemisphere? The cerebral hemisphere, it can be divided into four important lobes. The frontal lobe, which is mainly motor. So it means most of the motor activities in our body, they are controlled by the cerebral cortex in the frontal lobe. Then there is a parietal lobe. We have occipital lobe, and on the temporal side there is on the lateral side there is temporal lobe. Because this is the mid sagittal section, and you are looking at the medial side of the brain, so I am not able to show you the temporal side. The temporal side is here on the lateral side, and all these lobes, they are separated by some grooves which are called as sulci. For example, you can see here, this is a sulcus. So sulcus is like a depression, and in between the sulci, some prominent areas which are convolutions on the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, they are called as gyrus. So one is sulcus, multiple are sulci, sulcus and sulci, sulcus and sulci. And in between those sulci, for example, this area which will be a little bit raised and prominent, it will be called as a gyrus, and the plural will be gyri. This cerebral hemisphere on the surface is the cerebral cortex, and in deeper part is the white matter. So if I draw a diagram of the cerebral hemisphere from the um, coronal view, so how will it look like? It will be like this. So you can see here that in a coronal view, our brain will look like this. So this is the mid-sagittal section, this is the coronal section. On the surface, if you see here, this is the cerebral cortex. And cerebral cortex is made by the gray matter. And gray matter is actually the cell bodies of the neurons. Cell bodies of the neurons. So if these cell bodies of the neurons, they are present on the surface, we call it cortex, like the cerebral cortex. Similarly, on the surface of our cerebral hemisphere, there is also collection of the cell bodies of the neurons, which we call as the cerebellar cortex. This is cerebral cortex, and here on the surface of the cerebellum, there is cerebellar cortex. And deeper to that, this part is the white matter. Why this is white matter? Because it contains the tracts, the sensory and motor tracts. Sensory tracts, they are ascending upwards towards the cerebral cortex, and the motor tracts, they are descending downwards. So because the sensory and motor nerve fibers, they are myelinated, so they look white. And because the cell bodies, they are not myelinated, they look gray. Because cell bodies, they contain nucleus and other organelles, so they look gray. They are not myelinated, but the tracts, they look white. Here in this white matter, there are collection of some cell bodies which we call as nuclei. As I mentioned before, the collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system, that will be called as a nucleus. But what do you think? What is the collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system? What do we call it? We call it ganglia, like dorsal root ganglia. So here, this is our thalamus. Thalamus. Okay, on the lateral sides of the thalamus, here we have some basal nuclei like putamen, caudate, the globus pallidus nucleus. We also have some other nuclei like this one. This is hippocampus, and here another one which is called as amygdala. So it means in a coronal section of our cerebral hemisphere, you can see that on the surface there is cerebral cortex. Deeper to that is the white matter, and then in the white matter are embedded some collections of cell bodies which are called as nuclei. So thalamus all contains so many nuclei, and then we have these putamen, caudate, and globus pallidus, which are called as basal nuclei. They should not be called as basal ganglia. They are better called as basal nuclei. Here is hippocampus, and here is the amygdala. What are the functions of cerebral cortex on the surface? Cerebral cortex is very important for the perception of sensations, like the general sensations from the skin, the touch, pressure, vibration, and they are perceived in our cerebral cortex. And the special sensations, which are from some special organs, like vision from our eyes, hearing from our ears, taste from our tongue, and the olfaction or smell from our nose. These are special sensations which are not present everywhere, rather they are localized in some special organs. So these are perceived in our cerebral cortex, number one. Cerebral cortex is also very important to uh, plan and perform precise body movements. Cerebral cortex is also very important for storage of memory. It also controls your motivation, your thought process, your cognition. You are aware of the environment. This is because your cerebral cortex is working. The basal ganglia, they are also important to control your body movements. So basal ganglia, actually they receive information from different lobes of the cerebral cortex, and then they send information to the frontal lobe, and they are important in controlling the movements. Actually basal ganglia, they're part of the extrapyramidal system. They're part of the extrapyramidal system, and we will study some diseases which are related to basal ganglia, and one very important disease is Parkinson disease. This one, the hippocampus. Hippocampus is another deep nucleus which is present, which is embedded in the white matter of brain. This is related to the emotional nervous system, and it also stores memory. And amygdala controls our emotions, and this also controls our feeding reflexes, like in response to food, the salivation in animals, the licking of lips. These kind of functions are controlled by amygdala. It also sends signals to our hypothalamus, and then hypothalamus, along with our autonomic nervous system, controls various emotional responses, like in response to our emotions, the change in the size of pupil, the change in our blood pressure, change in our heart rate. So these kind of functions, they are controlled by the amygdala. What is the function of our cerebellum? Cerebellum is very uh, strategically located in between the spinal cord and the cerebral cortex. It is very important to control our balance, equilibrium, and this is important for coordination of movements, like the coordination of movements of your limbs, and also coordination of the movements of your eyes when your head is moving. This is the function of our cerebellum. It also controls your posture, along with other structures which are present in our medulla and pons. Cerebellum, it takes signals from the spinal cord and also from the brainstem, and also gets signal from the cerebral cortex. And cerebellum also gets signals from our vestibular nuclei. The signal which are coming from our internal ear, they're also given to the cerebellum. So by comparing that information which is coming from the proprioceptors along the spinal cord to the cerebellum, and also the motor signals coming from the higher brain centers from the cerebral cortex, and also the auditory the vestibular signals which are coming from the internal ear, cerebellum is very important to make your movements smooth, to make them coordinated. So this controls your balance, your equilibrium, and also controls the coordinated movements of your eyes when your head is moving. So this was a brief overview of various structures which are present in the central nervous system. Please keep in mind, the nervous system is very complex. There's so many structures. I was just giving you an overview, and we will study the details of each and every part of our brain later on. And also we will study the diseases which are associated with those structures. After having an overview of the parts of our central nervous system and their major functions, now let's discuss some common features of the sensory and motor systems. We are going to study the sensory physiology and motor physiology in very much detail, but before studying the specific sensory and motor details, there are some common features, there are some common themes in both the sensory and motor systems which I would like to discuss with you. So some common features of sensory and motor systems. So first feature is the synaptic relays. Synapse is a site of functional contact between two excitable tissues, and the simplest type of synapse which can be seen in our body is one-on-one synapse, like the synapse between a motor neuron that's supplying a skeletal muscle. So it's a simple kind of synapse in which there is no interneuron present. So from one neuron, one excitable tissue to the muscle. But there are complex synapses and connections present between the neurons in our body, and in those cases the relay centers, they play their function. For example, in spinal cord and our brainstem, there are synaptic relays present, in which between the presynaptic neurons and the postsynaptic neurons, some interneurons are also located. So between the sensory and motor neurons, some interneurons are also located. For example, in case of withdrawal reflex, when your hand touches to some hot object, so the signals of the heat which are coming along the heat fibers, they are going to spinal cord, and then the information is processed at the level of interneurons, and then the motor neurons, they will bring the signal to our muscles to withdraw our hand. But the interneurons, they will be playing the role of the relay there. So at the relay center, interneurons are present, but some other projection neurons are also present. You see, the role of interneuron is between afferent neuron. So if this is afferent neuron, which is bringing its signal from the periphery, is bringing its signal from the periphery. The signal is coming along the central part of this sensory neuron to some interneuron here, and then the interneuron, after picking this signal, it's giving its signal to motor neuron, and that motor neuron, it brings a signal towards the periphery, towards our skeletal muscle, so that we draw our hand. So this interneuron is having a relay function, but some neurons here, they have projection function, which means the projection fibers, they go either upward or downward. So it means the projection neurons, they can take signal from one relay center to the other relay center, maybe to the thalamus. So thalamus is one of the main relay centers in our body at which the information is processed, and that signal may go to other higher relay centers or may go to some cerebral cortex. So synaptic relays is one of the important features of both sensory and motor systems, in which signal is processed at the level of interneurons, and then some projection neurons, they may take signal to some other relay centers or even to the higher level of our cerebral cortex. The second important feature, which is common in both sensory and motor system, is the topographical organization, which means that the signals which are traveling along the sensory tract or the motor tract, it has a neural map. For example, the somatosensory signals about the touch from our skin, which are going to our cerebral cortex, it has a map. I mean, which signals are coming from which part of the body, and that map, when it is drawn in the primary sensory cortex in our brain, we call it sensory homunculus. So that sensory homunculus, we will study it in greater detail. It You will study that it contains much more signals coming from our hand and from our lips, and especially the thumb and lips and tongue. That gives most of the signals to the primary sensory cortex. And also in that sensory homunculus, body is represented upside down, which means that our head is represented downwards and laterally, and legs are represented upwards and medially. So this map of the neural signals from the skin to our cerebral cortex, this is called as sensory homunculus. Similarly, the signals which are going from our ears to our brain is also having a map which is called as tonotopic map, the map for different frequencies, from for low frequencies, medium frequencies, and the higher frequencies. And the signals which are going from our eyes to our occipital lobe is also having a map which is called as retinotopic map. I mean, signals are coming from right eye or from the left eye, and then from the lateral half of the retina or from the medial half of the retina. So this kind of signals, they will be called as retinotopic signals, and these maps of the sensory information, they are called as topographical map. And similarly, we have maps for the motor information. So the motor information which is coming from the motor cortex to our body, so that's also having a map, and that map is very similar to the sensory map, which is taking general sensory information from the periphery to our center. We'll study all these sensory and motor maps later on in detail. Another important common feature of the sensory and motor system is the decussation. The word decussation means crossing over of the sensory or motor signals. You see, most of the sensory and motor information on two sides of the body is symmetrical, and information crosses from one side of the body to the other side. The touch signals from right side, they go to the left side of our brain, left cerebral hemisphere, and similarly the touch signal from the left side, they go to the right side of our brain. And also the motor activities of the left half of the body, they are regulated by the right cerebral hemisphere, and the motor activities of the right side of the body, they are regulated by the left cerebral hemisphere. So in both cases, whether it is sensory information or the motor information, the signal goes from one side of the body to the other side. Now, if you talk about this crossing over, where does it take place? It depends upon which system we are talking about. If you talk about the anterolateral system or the spinothalamic pathway, the sensory information crosses at the level of spinal cord from one side to the other side. Spinothalamic pathway, it carries the signals of pain and temperature. It crosses as soon as it enters in our spinal cord, it crosses from one side to the other side. And some of the information like carried by dorsal column pathway. The information like vibration, fine touch, the proprioception, that crosses from one side of the body to the other side at the level of medulla. So the vibration sensation from the right side of the body, it will cross to the opposite side at the level of medulla. So as long as the information is ascending on the same side, we call it ipsilateral, and when the information crosses to the other side, then we call it contralateral. This crossing over, it has some clinical implications. For example, if there is cut to a tract before it crosses over, so what will happen? Those loss of signals which are being carried by it, they will be on the same side. But if the information has crossed from one side to the other side and then that tract is cut, then the loss of information will be on the opposite side of the body. So if this tract is cut when it has crossed from one to other side, then the loss of signal, if it is cut on the left side, the loss of signal will be on the right side. But if this tract has not been crossed from one side to the other side, then if it is cut, the signals will be lost on the same side or ipsilaterally. There are some tracts within our nervous system which contains the crossing information from one side to the other side, and these kind of bundles or tracts of nerve fibers, they are called as commissures. They are those tracts or bundles which takes signal from one side of the spinal cord to the other side, or from one side of brain to the other side. For example, corpus callosum is largest commissure or commissural fiber which connects our right cerebral hemisphere to the left cerebral hemisphere. So this kind of fibers which are crossing from one side of our nervous system, central nervous system, to the other side, we call them commissural fibers. And those kind of nerve fibers which connect one side of our brain from anterior to the posterior and from posterior to the anterior, but on the same side, we call them association fibers. So now you have studied three kind of fibers: the ascending tracts and descending tracts, which are passing through the spinal cord, the ascending and descending. And then you have also studied the commissure, the commissural fibers which cross from one side to the other side, and then the association fibers which are on the same side but go from one side, I mean maybe from the frontal side to the dorsal side, or from the posterior to the anterior side of the cerebral hemisphere. So this kind of fibers, they are called as association fibers. Keep in mind that in some sensory systems, the information may be partially crossed and partially uncrossed. For example, in visual system, the information from our eyes, it goes ipsilaterally, half of the information goes ipsilaterally and half of the information goes contralaterally. So our eyes, they send information to both the cerebral cortices on the same side and on the other side. And this crossing over of information from one eye to the other side, it takes place at a structure which is called as optic chiasma. Another important feature which I would like to discuss about the uh, common feature about the sensory and motor system is the types of nerve fibers. The nerve fibers which are used by the sensory and motor system for the transmission of the signals, they vary in terms of their diameter and their myelination. So some nerve fibers, they are having smaller diameter and some are having larger diameter, and some nerve fibers, they may be myelinated and some may not be myelinated. So these two features, they determine the velocity of conduction along the nerve fibers. So those nerve fibers which are myelinated and also having a larger diameter, they are fastest to conduct, and those nerve fibers which are smaller in diameter and are not myelinated, they are slowest to conduct. So myelination and larger diameter, they increase the speed of conduction of signal along the nerve fibers. So depending upon the diameter and myelination, we can classify nerve fibers into two groups. One is the general classification of nerve fibers, and other classification of nerve fiber is the one which is used by the sensory physiologists. So in general classification, both sensory and motor nerve fibers are present, and in sensory classification, only the sensory nerve fibers are present. We will study these types of nerve fibers in detail in our next lecture. So I would like to end this introduction to nervous system